in his own party. That presidential balloting comes tomorrow night, according to the schedule, but the matter could very well be settled out here on the floor of this convention in Kemper Arena tonight. There will be a vote tonight that both sides acknowledge will test their strength, which could make or break their candidate here. It will be on a change in the party rules. 16C is the number of that new rule, proposed by the Reagan side, that would force President Ford to name his vice presidential running mate by tomorrow morning, 12 hours before the presidential balloting is scheduled to begin. Also tonight, perhaps the other rules fights in a contest over the party's platform on which the candidates are expected to run. We'll be hearing more about the details of those in the next few minutes. Also tonight, a speech by John Connally, the former governor of Texas and Nixon cabinet official, one-time Democrat turned Republican, and capable of a rousing speech from this podium that could affect the convention's course and his own political future. Connally's a Ford supporter with strong ambitions of his own. President Ford has broken the precedent of the years past to come to this convention to take personal charge of his forces, and the day has been perhaps the most important for him, of course, as the key battles of his nomination fight come to a head tonight. Bob Schieffer reports on the President's Day. Bob?
Walter, the president spent a lot of time today visiting with various state delegations. He went to some of the headquarters hotels in his limousine. He had other delegations into his headquarters here on the 18th floor of this hotel. One of the things that you come away with after talking to people around here, Walter, members of the White House staff, people in this headquarters hotel, is this. The Ford people seem a lot more confident now about their vote count. They seem to think now that they have the votes to get the nomination. On the other hand, they're very worried about this 16C thing that'll be coming up tonight, the move to force the president to name his running mate early. One of the reasons they are worried is that the Ford organization, we're told, conducted a poll, and it showed that while they would win on the issue, they'd probably win by a very thin margin, about 10 votes or so. Ford people know just as well as anybody else, when you've got a margin that thin, anything can happen. They also know that if somehow the Reagan forces should push that through, then there's a good chance that it's going to cost Mr. Ford some votes somewhere if he does have to name that nominee early. So that's why they're going to be working very hard against 16C tonight. And by the same token, I suppose that's why the Reagan folks will be working very hard to try to get it approved. Walter?
This has been a crucial day as well for the president's challenger, Ronald Reagan. Barry Seraphin reports on what he's been up to.
Walter, first of all, the Reagan camp is operating on the premise that the actual delegate battle is much closer than most counts indicate. Based on that premise, Governor Reagan today was busy going from hotel to hotel, delegation to delegation, stressing two main things. First, reiterating very firmly that he would not accept a vice presidential spot on a Ford ticket if the incumbent were to be this convention's nominee. Reagan said over and over again that he would instead go back to the private life, turning out speeches, turning out radio broadcasts, syndicated news columns, thereby maintaining what he called his independence to criticize government policy when he thought that was warranted. Now, second, he's been emphasizing and stressing this Rule 16 battle. This is a Reagan proposal which would force Mr. Ford to name his prospective running mate in advance of the presidential balloting tomorrow. Reagan has been arguing to delegations that since he has named his potential running mate, Senator Schweiker, in advance, the delegates have a right to know who Mr. Ford would choose. This is a point he's been making throughout the day, over and over again. The Reagan people think that this is a test of strength, that a win on this issue would indicate a Reagan strength within this convention. And they think that anyone Mr. Ford might have to name in advance would be liable to offend someone and would cost him some delegate support somewhere within this convention. Most observers with whom I've talked think that a win by the Reagan people on this issue would not automatically mean a nomination victory for Governor Reagan tomorrow. They feel, however, that a loss might fatally hurt his nomination chances. The people in the Reagan camp don't go that far. They do have their own delegate head count on the Rule 16 fight. They're not revealing it. They're not saying whether they see a win or a loss, but they don't appear to be too worried. I think they think they've got a good chance on this one, Walter.
The reason that this is so critical, of course, is because the balance between the Ford and the Reagan forces when it comes to the presidential balloting tomorrow night is so narrow. As according to our CBS News delegate poll, however, President Ford at this moment is running around 11 votes more than those he needs. He needs 1130 tomorrow night. Our delegate count indicates he's got 1141. In other words, he would win it. Reagan has 1,040, and there's still 78 undetermined. But anything such as this Rule 16 fight could overturn those delegate counts. So it won't be final, of course, until the balloting is actually done tomorrow night. Now, 16C is going to be a very interesting parliamentary fight tonight. A lot of things are going to happen out there as the matter comes up. And Bruce Morton on the podium is going to be following it all the way through, and he'll be able to tell us what is happening from the podium, we assume, Bruce. And you can tell us at least in advance what you expect to happen. Bruce?
Walter, what we've learned are the ground rules for this fight, kind of a modified Marquis of Queensberry. It'll work this way. Kent Magoo, who's the Ohio State chairman and also the chairman of the convention's Rules Committee, will read a report on all the rules, everything the committee considered. That's supposed to take about 5 minutes. Then there will be 30 minutes of debate on this vice presidential rule number 16C. Tom Curtis, the former congressman from Missouri, will lead the pro-Reagan forces along with 3 other unnamed speakers. There'll be 6 unnamed speakers for the Ford side. Neither side wants to tell the other one who its heavy hitters are going to be. Then there's a vote. There are also all sorts of rumors about other proposed rules changes. Those presumably would get 5 minutes debate per side apiece. We'll see how it goes. Walter?
Okay, Bruce. Our floor correspondents, of course, are going to be following all of these intricate maneuverings tonight among the delegates on that rules fight. They can tell us what they expect at the floor. First, Roger Mudd. Roger?
Walter, President Ford's floor agents have been working the floor in the last 20 minutes. I've talked to several of them, Dean Birch and Bill Timmons, and they are nervously confident. Dean Birch says they think they'll win by about 25, even though an earlier report said they thought it would be about by 10. The biggest argument against Rule 16C, as the Reagan bandwagon slows down a little, is that voting for it would mean that the door would be left open for a Reagan vice presidency. And that's the argument you hear in this section of the floor. Dean Birch said if we lose this, we don't expect to, but if we lose it, it will certainly heighten the anticipation for tomorrow morning. One member of the Ford staff said President Ford should never reveal his vice presidential selection except in his will. Now to Mike Wallace.
Well, there are 2 vital delegations here in this part of the floor, Walter. New Jersey and Mississippi, and both of them caucused this afternoon on this item, this vice presidential item called 16C. And neither one of them gave the Reagan people the support that they wanted. In New Jersey, 67 votes, 61, according to our understanding, against the Reagan 16C amendment, 4 for it, 2 abstentions. Now, all along, they've been saying in New Jersey there are hidden votes for Ronald Reagan and his proposals in that Jersey delegation. None showed apparently this afternoon, and I think that's what we're going to see here this evening. 61 out of 67 against 16C. The big surprise, as you reported, Walter, on your evening news tonight, was Mississippi. They held a caucus this afternoon, and they voted 31 to 28 against 16C. Now, some people say that's Ford's strength. Some people say that some of the Reagan people went along because they didn't want Gerald Ford to have to nominate Ronald Reagan for his vice presidency or for his vice presidential running mate before this thing came to its climax tomorrow. The fact remains, though, that they voted as a unit. And so there are going to be 30 votes in this Mississippi delegation cast against Ronald Reagan's 16C. Now to Dan Rather.
This section of the floor have been talking to various delegates, and it's very difficult to find a delegate on either side of this issue of trying to force President Ford to name his vice presidential selection before the presidential nomination. It's very difficult to find anybody on either side of that who believes if the president is forced to do that he won't name Howard Baker of Tennessee. The general thinking is that if 16C passes, that Baker's chances for the vice presidential nomination jump considerably. It's speculation on everybody's part, but that is the speculation that runs fairly heavily down here. The big delegation to watch as far as this particular section of the floor is concerned, is Pennsylvania. It's one where, frankly, if the Reagan forces are going to get what they want tonight on this issue of forcing President Ford to get out front with his vice presidential nomination, that they've got to win over some people in the Pennsylvania delegation. Our own straw poll of the delegation done late this afternoon indicates that they won't be able to do that. We have in the Pennsylvania delegation a rough vote of 85 against the proposal, 18 in favor of Amendment 16C. To repeat for emphasis, if that holds in Pennsylvania, it's difficult to see how the Reagan forces can win. The Nixon people, the slip of the tongue, sorry to say, the Ford people were out here very early this evening checking out all of their communications equipment. They still have on the floor, by far, an organizational setup that is much better than anything the Reagan people have put out. They have walkie-talkie plus telephone communication. They have a lot of experienced convention people. The Reagan people, by comparison, are far more inexperienced and have a far less efficient telephone system. As far as I know, they don't have any walkie-talkie system at all. Over in the Texas delegation, Ray Barnhart, the chairman of that delegation, who figures he can deliver, if not all of his 100 delegate votes for the Reagan side of this proposal on the vice presidential matter, was telling his delegates this afternoon that this evening's session may last well past midnight, and said, Mr. Barnhart, to his delegates, stick it out. Snore in place if you have to, but don't let your body depart. Now to Morton Dean.
At the risk of restating the obvious with a sense of discovery, this issue does create a face-off situation between Mr. Reagan and Mr. Ford, but it's not quite just that. It's more than that. There are a couple of things happening on the floor which could muddy the entire outcome of this vote on the 16C, the vice presidential issue. Some Ford people say they are going to vote against President Ford on this amendment. They seem to be saying that while they want to buy a Ford, they want to see what the accessories will look like before completing the purchase. And we hear from some Reagan delegates, we've only talked with a few, but some few Reagan delegates who say they are going to vote against Reagan on this amendment because they think it's unfair. And is an example of the kind of intense pressure and the kind of battle that is being waged here, Walter, on just about every, if not every, seat in this fall, is this little piece of paper handed out by the President Ford Committee. It says, vote no on 16C, and said that you should oppose the amendment because it prevents a Ford-Reagan ticket, since Governor Reagan could not at this time consent to the president's vice president as required by the amendment. Point 2, it eliminates the consultation with Governor Reagan for the president's vice presidential nomination. In other words, the Ford people are saying, look, Reagan's not going to win this presidential nomination, and unless you vote against 16C, Reagan is not going to be considered for vice president, nor will he have a say in the vice presidential nominee the president finally picks. Got that, Walter?
I think I have, Morton. There are other subtleties in the matter, too, as suggested by Dan Rather there, and that's that if 16C is voted tonight, the chances of President Ford naming tomorrow morning a moderate in order not to sway against him any of those who would support people on the fringes is greatly enhanced. And that would be, for instance, Howard Baker, although there are other moderates who might satisfy both the liberals and the more conservatives in the party. And so we're all sort of standing aside here for the shootout in the KC stockyards. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message. Back here at Kemper Arena, the session is scheduled to begin in about 13 minutes from now, the session that may tell whether President Ford will get the nomination of his party or will it be the challenger, Ronald Reagan. Eric Severide and Bill Moyers are going to, of course, be watching this rules fight with us tonight. They have some thoughts for us, gentlemen.
Well, this matter of the vice president, pretty important matter for the country. It's a pity if a president is forced to choose in terms of winning a nomination rather than in terms of winning the election and in terms of the future of the country should a president suddenly cease to be alive and a vice president becomes president. After all, 4 out of the last 6 presidents, I think it is, were vice presidents. So, of course, the Ford people were going to oppose this. he wants somebody who can help him in the election, most of all, but also somebody who could be president if necessary. If he loses this rule fight tonight, then I think what Walter and Dan Rather were suggesting probably is true, don't you think, Bill? It'd be someone like Baker, an inoffensive moderate.
Yes, and you really do need to keep in mind that this proposal was not born out of any great thirst for reform. They tell a story down in Texas about a fellow who had to get had to have a shotgun wedding. He thought that's the only way you ought to get married after that, since it took the onus off his own indiscretion. Well, Ronald Reagan's trying to turn this convention into a double shotgun wedding. Eric, he wants to try to cost forward the support of delegates who will be angered no matter whom he chooses.
The high moral tone of this amendment they propose, they say the fiasco of the Democratic choice in 72 has shown that the problem is very real, must be solved. That they're talking about the Eastland case. They do not talk about the business of Mr. Agnew in 72, or 68 rather.
Well, would 10 hours make that much difference?
That's the point. The people would have 10 hours to react politically, whether they are mad at whoever makes that choice or not, but to react in terms of investigating the man, finding out about his character, his finances, his health. It's absurd. It'd do nothing.
It also violates the fundamental rule of politics, which is reciprocity. It would mean that the winner, the presidential nominee, would be unable to select the loser as his running mate. And that's a kind of closing down of possibilities that turns politics into an ideological feud instead of an agent or instrument of reconciliation.
There's also the secondary, long-distance, practical matter. Future conventions would set a precedent here. So if you came into the next convention in 4 years with several candidates, each with a big block of delegates, thinking they have a real serious chance to be president, none of them could designate one of the others as vice president in advance. The show would be over. They would have betrayed all their followers. That's a secondary consideration, but it's a very real one.
Well, if a liberal nominee for president, for example, or a conservative, announces 10 hours in advance that he's selecting someone of the opposite persuasion, he doesn't make the other people necessarily happy, and he's likely to make his own people very unhappy. On the other hand, if he chooses a liberal, he runs the risk of making the battle more pitched and enduring and unreconcilable.
The selection is much more important for what's happening here, of course, than it is for next November. No vice president on a ticket has ever increased a presidential candidate's vote by a popular vote more than about 2%. So they can bring in an occasional state like LBJ in 1960 with Kennedy, helped to give him Texas and Louisiana, helped to elect him. That was a very close calculation. But even on the national vote, I think even LBJ cost him a little bit.
I would suspect that as of right now or tomorrow morning, Gerald Ford doesn't really know whom he should take for the best interest of the party or for the best interest of the country.
No, and I think he has to find out what happens here tonight before he does. Back to Walter Cronkite.
We'll be back in 1 minute with more CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention. As this crucial session of the Republican National Convention is just 10 minutes or so away, it is generally agreed, apparently, in Kansas City tonight that the momentum is now with President Ford. Nearly all of the delegate polls by various news media indicate that Ford has gone over the top, somewhere around a margin of 5 to 10 votes. And UPI, the United Press News Service, today quoted a Reagan aide as saying, "He's lost it. I don't see how he can pull it off." Well, John Sears, his campaign manager, a very smart political manager, and Ronald Reagan himself hoped to pull it off by such maneuvers as the fight on Rule 16C tonight, possibly a fight, too, over the platform. That comes up tonight, too. The 21,000-word document that sets how the candidate should campaign and what the Republican Party stands for. There are going to be some amendments offered tonight. One will be an amendment supported by the Reagan forces and the so-called independent conservatives here that would in effect criticize the Henry Kissinger, Gerald Ford foreign policy. That matter will be before the floor later tonight if they get these rules things settled before dawn tomorrow. 16C is really the name of the game because that comes up first, a major test vote. We haven't had a test vote of this nature in a political convention since, well, 1964 at any rate, when the liberal Scranton forces put a platform fight before the convention, lost it, and it was proof that the Goldwater forces indeed controlled that convention in San Francisco. Roger Mudd is with a Georgia delegate who is against the vice presidential amendment, but is going to vote for it anyway, I gather, Roger.
Well, this is Matt Mattingly. He's the state chairman of the GOP in Georgia. If Ronald Reagan is going to win on 16C, he's going to have to get all the votes he can get. Georgia is a Reagan state, but already there are some votes in Georgia that will not vote for 16C. Why is that, Mr. Mattingly?
Well, Roger, I believe they see it as maybe just an attempt by John Sears, the campaign technique to try to possibly not necessarily embarrass the president, but try to put him in a corner to change some delegate votes. And I think both Reagan supporters and Ford supporters see this. I think this could be indicative tonight of the vote and how it goes.
Well, is it true that while you do not favor 16C, you're going to have to vote for it?
Yes, I will. But there's a lot of people in the delegation, I think a lot of other delegations that are not necessarily bound like I am by that moral obligation or obligation by law. And I think that this vote, no matter how it comes out tonight, is probably not going to be indicative of the vote tomorrow night. Because I think that as it stands right now, I believe President Ford probably has the edge. And the only way that probably the governor has a hope of trying to win the nomination is trying to get the president to name his vice presidential nominee.
Okay. Thank you, Walter.
Most of the Mississippi delegation remains officially uncommitted on the question of who should be the presidential nominee, but they made up their minds today on this rules fight. Mike Wallace is with the delegation chairman, Gil Carmichael.
And, Walter, as you know, Gil Carmichael is the leader of the Ford forces in Mississippi. He ran for governor down there, and he almost took it last year. Gil Carmichael, 30 votes against Ronald Reagan's 16C in Mississippi. How come?
It was a vote today, and it couldn't help but be interpreted as a Ford vote, a pro-Ford vote. There was a real desire in the delegation to be very fair. And
well, you people voted 31-28.
31-28, that's right.
One person not there.
Right.
And then, as a result of that, you do invoke the unit rule, so it is 30-0. Now, does that reflect the fact that certain Reagan people simply went along with you? Explain the vote to us.
No, I think what happened is, like Deanie Pace today, the decision was made. The Ford strength has been there, and a lot of people didn't believe it. There's a strong support for President Ford and a strong support for Governor Reagan, and this brought it out. We kind of divided up in the room and cast our votes like that. So Clark Reed voted for 16C, but he's committed himself to President Ford. So that gives us 32 votes, which I'd say the president's got 16-plus votes tomorrow night.
What you seem to be saying is that the Mississippi delegation could go for President Ford for the nomination.
That's right.
Tomorrow night.
That's right.
One quick note. Yesterday morning, Walter, you remember Deanie Pace was the uncommitted delegate from Mississippi who said that she was going to give us the news first. Ms. Pace, you've now decided in favor of
President Ford.
Gerald Ford.
Right.
And you say that you were going to get a message from up on high. Is that where you got it?
Pardon me? Yes, I prayed all night last night.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
All right. 30 votes against 16C in Mississippi, and conceivably a Ford majority for the nomination in Mississippi, which would be a big surprise tomorrow night, Walter.
Please let me make that point.
Dan Rather is with one of the Ford floor leaders who will be watching his delegates closely on these floor fights, Carl Curtis of Nebraska. Senator, come in, Dan.
Senator Curtis, what is the strongest argument that you've found to use with people who say, well, I'm going to vote for President Ford for the presidential nomination, but I really want to support the Reagan people on this matter of getting the president out front with his vice presidential choice?
Well, first, I don't know any Ford people who do that.
You don't know a single one?
No. This is a scheme to lock Schweiker in for vice president. Reagan has his package. If the convention would vote to force Ford to have a package, they'd vote between the two packages, and Schweiker would be home free. Schweiker can't be nominated on the floor of this convention in a straight-out fight. Now, if this new rule is adopted, it locks Schweiker in if Reagan wins. If Ford wins, it locks Reagan out. It's foolish. Why, it would prevent Ford from even conferring with Reagan about vice president because he couldn't do it until after the contest's over.
Now, just before we went on the air, a few minutes, there were 3 or 4 members of the Texas delegation over here, Reagan supporters, who were trying to convince you that that wasn't true. Did you find that argument persuasive with them?
Not at all. They can't explain away Schweiker. They can't nominate him on this floor. And this is a ruse to lock him in without a direct vote.
Who would run best? You're a Ford backer. You want President Ford to get the nomination. Who would run best with him in Nebraska?
Reagan. And that's locked out if they vote for this new rule.
You think there's any chance that Reagan would accept it despite what he said?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes?
Now he would say no. He probably would say no still till Thursday morning. But at least he could be consulted. And in the past, I've known a lot of candidates who said no, and in the morning they said yes.
Walter, that's the kind of argument the Ford supporters are giving against 16C.
And, of course, what Senator Curtis is talking about is the fact that there's a large movement on the behalf among the more conservative delegates here that even if their candidate Reagan is nominated for the presidency, they would vote against his vice presidential choice, Richard Schweiker, when it got to that vote on Thursday. It seems that almost every few minutes now, since, well, early this afternoon at any rate, we get another little indication from our delegate count that Ford is building his momentum. We just got word from our people who are keeping track of the delegates one by one, feed them into our computers, that Teddy Bailey, a delegate from Virginia, just told CBS that he would vote for President Ford. He'd previously been counted by CBS as having no preference, so now the Ford delegate count by CBS goes up another one to 1,141. The convention is just getting underway now, this crucial session of the convention, with the trooping of the colors into the hall. CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention will continue in a moment.
CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76. The second session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company on behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers. Ford wants to be your car company.
Can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the rampart we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets went clear, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
That was Gordon McRae, popular singer, singing the national anthem opening this session of the convention.
The invocation will be given by one of my good friends in the Congress, one of the outstanding members in the Congress, From the 1st District of Minnesota, a delegate at large, the Honorable Al Quie.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you that also, besides the invocation, if you would communicate with God in your own way. Let us bow our heads and hearts. O Lord God, we acknowledge that you created and planned all in the universe and created us in your image. Our hearts are filled with thanksgiving this evening that you care for us, that we can safely worship you and share with others our belief in you, that we as a minority in this nation can assemble to state what we stand for and select our Republican choice for president and vice president. Oh, that your presence may infect us. Fill us with your wisdom through your Holy Spirit. We have differences of opinion, as you know, and help us that we might love each other with the love of Christ as we push for what we believe in and who we believe in. And while we need your forgiveness, O Lord, help us, above all, to be forgiving of others. And lastly, may I remind all of us who are gathered here of your words to your disciples when James and John asked to sit at your right hand and left hand in your kingdom. And you said, we are to be different. Whoever would be great must be a servant, just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
The convention is now going to hear some brief remarks on the POW missing in action issue from Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Schrump. Colonel Schrump retired from the Army in 1973 after being a prisoner of war for 5 years from 1968 to 73 in Vietnam. On Thursday, the North Carolina delegation is considering honoring Colonel Schrump by putting his name into nomination on the vice presidential ballot. Thereafter, in the early part of this evening, for around 15 minutes or so, there are remarks to be heard from Representative Millicent Fenwick of New Jersey, and Patricia Hooter, the president of the National Federation of Republican Women, and then the introduction of Senator Connally, former Governor Connally, excuse me. The presiding officer tonight is the temporary chairman, Senator Bob Dole of Kansas.
I would ask you, if all possible, if you would please take your seats. We have a most important guest. It is my honor to introduce to you one of the greatest Americans of our generation. No one appreciates how long a single day is until he has spent days as a POW in a communist prison. Colonel Raymond Schrump, delegate from North Carolina, spent 5 years as a POW during the Vietnam War. With him in that communist prison camp was a friend of mine, John Dunn from Hutchinson, Kansas. It would be emotional for me to tell you the dynamic faith in God, country, and liberty that Ray Schrump had himself engendered in his fellow prisoners. Decorated for his bravery with 2 Silver Stars, 2 Legions of Merit, 3 Purple Hearts, and 2 awards of the Combat Infantry Badge, it is the greatest of honors for me to introduce to the entire free world Colonel Raymond Schrump and Mrs. Schrump. Colonel Schrump.
Senator Doyle, distinguished guests, fellow Republicans, as I stand here before this convention and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, I pray that he will bless the men and their families of whom I am about to speak. As you all know now, my background is largely that of a career soldier, and now for at least the past 2 years a small businessman. As you will immediately become aware, I am neither a politician or a speaker. However, I do claim a cherished and priceless title, the most important in these United States. I am a private citizen of this republic. With your permission tonight, I shall exercise not only some of the rights and privileges of that citizenship, but more importantly, some of the responsibilities that go along with the title. That is, quite simply, to come here and speak to you of the things that are on my mind and in my heart concerning the condition and the direction of our country. Having spent 5 years of my life denied the freedoms I once took for granted, I came to realize just how precious those freedoms really are, and today I cherish them beyond words. I attribute my homecoming to 3 basic faiths: faith in God, faith in my country, faith in my fellow man. It is altogether fitting and timely in this year of our 200th anniversary as the greatest republic of all time to reaffirm ourselves to the preservation not only to those basic faiths of which I spoke, but to the basic principles on which this country was founded. America is the only country in the world who knows the true cost of freedom, and that cost can only be measured in human life and personal sacrifices. Regardless of your feelings and mine on the Vietnam War or how it was conducted, what is more important today is how to resolve the last chapter of the Vietnam War, how to obtain the release of the remaining men still being held and the return of those who died so that they may be properly buried. As a typical average American, I do not understand the intricacies of the world of politics, but I am learning fast. We elect individuals to political office with a fervent hope they will protect our rights and liberties and love America as much as we do, individually and collectively. That personal gain and quest for political power will not be the overriding consideration when hard decisions must be made on our behalf. However, my efforts on behalf of our prisoners of war and missing in action has given me pause to wonder. Where are the patriotic leaders in our country who will take a stand on behalf of the men they asked to serve? Today, in this great and free nation of ours, there are many wives and children and parents who have only loved to keep alive their hope for a loved one listed as a prisoner of war or missing in action. Only God knows how many men are trying to stay alive on memories of such a love. We do not know the status of over 1,000 men listed as missing in action. These men left this country and endorsed our nation's commitment to its allies. That endorsement was not accomplished merely by a signature on a bill or a treaty, but by personal sacrifice of life and freedom. Nor do they enjoy any of the rights and privileges that we often take for granted and for which they were willing to pay the ultimate price. Must their endorsement now be forfeit while amnesty is granted to those who refuse to support our national interest. The idea that this manner of recognition of patriotism and dedication to duty is becoming the in thing, and it is a fearsome thought indeed. As a matter of national integrity, we are morally bound to a complete accounting and recognition of these lost men. Are we, the American people, going to allow the leadership of this country that committed these lost men to their fate now be forgotten? Right now, more than ever before, we must return integrity and moral commitment to our government. The Democrats did not consider a platform for the prisoners of war or missing in action. However, I noted with great interest last month at the Democratic Convention that a draft evader from the Vietnam War was an elected delegate and spoke to that convention and asked for open-door amnesty and then was nominated as Vice President of the United States of America. Perhaps I am approved, but frankly, I don't want a draft evader or a deserter to have anything to say or to speak for me. Resolve today, now, that you will rededicate yourself to the cause of the National League of Families and end this anguish of these brave men and their families. This is the humanitarian way, but more importantly, it is the American way. Some of these men died in my presence, and I can assure you, not one ever lost his faith in his country, in his God, or in you, his fellow man. Poor is the nation that has no heroes. Shameful is the one that having them forgets. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Strump of Fayetteville, North Carolina, for 5 years a prisoner of war in Vietnam. The convention will now hear from Millicent Fenwick, a congresswoman from New Jersey. But meanwhile, on the floor, all of the talk is about the big fight to come tonight on that Rule 16C that would require President Ford to name his vice presidential running mate no later than tomorrow morning. For more on that fight over that rule change, here's Morton Dean with Representative Margaret Heckler of Massachusetts. Morton?
Walter, of course, this is a Reagan-Ford fight. Most of the conservatives are siding with Mr. Reagan on this, but there's an interesting sidelight in that Congresswoman person, what do you prefer? Congresswoman Heckler is a moderate, and she, in general terms, agrees with the Reagan position, but you won't be voting on that position. Why not?
I don't really agree with the requirement that the presidential candidate select his nominee before the nomination. I totally disagree with that.
But
I do agree that it is in the public interest to have all presidential candidates suggest to the press and to the public the names of their potential running mates. And I feel that would be a reform and would focus on the vice presidency. so that I agree in part, but not with the specifics of this. I think this particular 16C is really a political gimmick by a very shrewd but desperate campaign manager, and it's not a real reform.
But if you're saying on the one hand that the people, the press should know the type of men or women who are being considered for the vice presidency, well, why not agree with the idea of having Mr. Ford name his man?
Oh, I think that would be disastrous. I feel that the advantage of having the public and the media know who the candidates are thinking of as their running mates is that it would allow the exposure of these candidates to public view. The scrutiny of the press, the scrutiny of the public would then bring out the reflections on Connolly, for example, which came out and which were helpful. I do feel that the question of selection before the nomination goes too far. It ties the presidential candidate's hands. It makes him refer to the convention instead of the body politic.
Okay,
it's wrong.
but you would like for the next convention that there be some kind of an arrangement or rule that a man running for the president says, here, I'm considering the following individuals.
Yes, I do. I feel that that kind of a reform would be in the public interest. It would give us an idea who these vice presidential hopefuls might be. Their names would be before the public.
I want to put you right on the hot seat now.
Right.
If this was a Ford measure as opposed to it being a Reagan measure, you might be voting a bit differently on this.
No, I really would not, because I think that this convention does not represent the American people in its totality. And if I were to vote for that proposition, I would then be saying that this convention is representative and that the presidential candidate should reflect the needs of the convention and should go out to the convention and get the delegate strength and use that as a tool in choosing the vice presidency. I think that's wrong.
Okay, Congresswoman Heckler of Massachusetts. Walter?
The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will continue after this message. How do the Reagan forces look on this crucial fight on 16C tonight? Well, one of the people who can tell us is with Mike Wallace down there, Lynn Nofziger. He's the Reagan News Secretary. Mike?
Walter, actually, he's with Cassie Mackin of NBC at this moment. She's talking to him. Lynn Nofziger, as you know, has been with Ronald Reagan for, virtually since the beginning of his political career. He's very savvy, knows California politics, knows national politics, and he's undoubtedly read in on 16C. Let's join and have a pooled conversation here if we can.
On the nomination tomorrow.
It looks like right now they are not going to go Reagan's way. Were you surprised at that at this point in time? Weren't you really hoping they would fall in with you?
Well, Kathy, I'm not going to go with your assumption. I still think that we have a chance to get them to go our way.
Thank you. Lynn Nofziger, and now to Tom Brokaw.
Lynn, I wonder if you would look over here at camera 7 that has the CBS light on it.
Oh, I see camera 7. Some girl waving up there.
All right, now then. The Ford people have been putting out some literature which says vote no against 16C. I wonder if you'd answer their objections. They're suggesting that people oppose 16C because, 1, it prevents a Ford-Reagan ticket since Governor Reagan could not at this time consent to be the president's vice president as required by the Sears Amendment.
Mike, that's a phony issue, and they know it. Governor Reagan has made it very clear that he would not accept the vice presidency. It has no validity at all. It just wouldn't happen.
Number 2, it eliminates consultation with Governor Reagan for the president's vice presidential nomination, that is a fact. Obviously, the man is hardly going to call in Ronald Reagan and say, look, Ron, I want to name a vice president. I want your advice about all this, but I can't do it. On the count of 16C, I've got to do it before I can sit down and talk to you.
Oh, no, that's not true. If Gerald Ford wants to call the governor, I'm sure the governor will take his call.
I'm sure that he'd take his call, but he's hardly going to get that kind of a call. Look,
well, these are excuses, though, Mike. These are merely excuses. Most of the Ford people admit that this is a good proposal, and the only thing they're saying is don't do it this year because it might affect us.
I think that people across the United States are saying it's a very good idea, but why change the rules in the middle of the game? Why not look forward to 1980? Why not let's take our time and understand better how to choose a vice presidential candidate?
We are not in the middle of the game, Mike. In the first place, they've been at this for almost 4 years trying to figure out a way, without contradiction. Most people say this is a good way. The fact is that it is a good way, and
It's your only way, as a matter of fact, at this moment, Lynn. You know it.
Well, that's not so. I think that we're going to win on the platform issue, and I think we're going to win tomorrow night.
All right. The bottom line, of course, is votes. Make a prediction for us. Is it going to carry? If so, by how many?
Mike, it's going to carry, and I have never been so dumb as to give you a count.
You know that you lost Mississippi today. You know
I'm aware.
You know that you're not getting the votes that you had hoped for in New Jersey. You need all of those votes.
No, I don't. All I know is what Senator Case said, and he's been wrong before.
Well, Senator Case has just told me 62 out of 67 votes in New Jersey are going against 16C. One abstention for 16C. You need these votes, and you just don't seem to have them, at least in this part of the floor.
There are 167 votes right here on this part of the floor that are going to vote for 16C.
And those votes are going to come from California. I guess you can count on those. Thank you, Lynn.
I think we can.
Walter?
That floor fight is not very far away, the actual counting of it. When the floor fights begin, not all the action's going to be down there on the floor either. Some of it's going to be in the periphery of this area. The strategy for each side, the directions to the delegates and to the delegate hunters on the floor is run from the trailer area just outside the hall. Jim McManus is out there.
They're called communications trailers, or in more military parlance, command posts. The one behind us belongs to President Ford. Security here is so tight that these trailers are checked every day for electronic bugs and telephone wiretaps. Not that anyone from Washington, D.C. really ought to worry about a thing like that. The trailer behind us now belongs to Ronald Reagan. The general of the Reagan troops is John Sears. He sits here in a politician's version of a broadcast anchor booth. The telephone consoles are marked button by button for each delegation. And to keep track of the proceedings, a battery of television monitors. Area coordinators, 10 of them, man the telephones along the walls in these booths. They're in constant contact with their counterparts on the Kemper Arena floor, each of them responsible for 5 state delegations. In this case, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. This is the conference room. If Governor Reagan and Mrs. Reagan come here, this is where they will spend their time. And so as the Reagan forces get ready to do battle on the convention floor later this evening, this is the place from which it will all be directed. Jim McManus, CBS News, inside the Reagan command post near the Kemper Arena.
President Ford facing a challenge to nomination from his party, the first such by any political party of an incumbent president since 1912, is gaining momentum this evening. He has added a delegate and another delegate until now. Most of the news media polls of delegations show that he's over the top of the 1,130 needed. We at CBS News show he's got 11 more votes than he needs, but any of that could be upset, and one of the test votes comes tonight on this Rule 16C. That would, a Reagan-sponsored rule that would force President Ford to name his vice presidential candidate by tomorrow morning. The leader of the Reagan forces here is Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada. A short while ago, he talked about what he expects on this rules vote with Barry Serafin.
Senator Laxalt, how does the 16C fight shape up from the Reagan point of view?
Well, as of this moment, it looks good. I was a little worried about that Mississippi delegation going on a unit basis against us, but the last word I had a little while ago was that they'll break out on about a 16-14 basis.
16 in favor of Mr. Ford's side of the issue?
Yes, and 14 Reagan. And if we can hold it in on that basis, I think we're going to win this fight tonight.
Well, beyond Mississippi, what kind of a head count do you have on this issue?
Well, we looked at a head count this morning in the 1140 range on the assumption that Mississippi would break out even. So that's the range we're in. It's going to be terribly tight, but I'm very confident we're going to win this.
What would a loss mean to the Reagan nomination chances?
Well, it would be harmful, of course.
Fatal?
How harmful? Well, how harmful, Barry, would depend on the extent of the loss. If it's inside of 10 votes or so, I don't think it'd mean all that much. But I can't minimize the fact that this is a terribly important test vote for the Reagan people.
Perhaps the most important, isn't it?
This could well be the shootout.
Barry, a lot of, well, I'll get back to that later. What I was going to say was that Paul Laxalt earlier today had scaled down, it seemed to a lot of reporters, his estimate of first ballot Reagan strength. Now, John Sears, the campaign manager for Reagan has been saying 1,140 votes on the first ballot, enough to win, obviously, by 10 votes. But today, Laxalt was saying it would be something under 1,130 on the first ballot. An indication that perhaps some of the confidence has been shaken in the Reagan forces. But it's all going to come out in the wash, probably some indication of it, a great indication of it, on this vote on 16C tonight. Besides the Rule 16C fight, there may also be an effort to strike down Rule 18. That is a Ford-sponsored rule that would require the 19 states where the delegates are pledged to vote according to the results of their primary campaigns to vote that way and not to defect. This was aimed primarily at North Carolina, where a lot of the delegates are really Reagan delegates, but according to the way the vote went, most of them will have to vote for Ford on the first ballot. That's the primary vote in North Carolina. There was some talk that they might not vote that way and vote for Reagan instead, and hence this Ford defensive move. That's Rule 18, which will come before the convention also tonight. And then we'll move into the platform fight after the rules matter is settled, assuming that it is settled early enough tonight for this session to go on to a platform. There is some talk that it's possible that the rules fight could go on so long tonight that they would have to go into a daytime session tomorrow to get onto the platform before we move Wednesday night to the balloting for the presidential nomination. The campaign managers don't really want to do that. The convention managers don't want to do that. It's very costly to have a session in the afternoon. One problem they've got is that they use the city's buses to transport the delegates from their convention hotels, some of which are quite a way out of Kansas City, to this Kemper Arena area, and they can't get the buses in the middle of the day when they're used on their normal city routes. So there's a problem involved in changing the schedule to that degree. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message. In a very few minutes now, the convention will have presented to it the report of its Credentials Committee. The chairman of that is John McDonald, the Iowa National Committeeman. There were no fights in the Credentials Committee, but there were several challenges brought before the...
The word... Look at you and answer the question.
Here's Mrs. Ford outside the convention hall, and we're told she just had a little fall. Mariah McLaughlin is there.
Well, I hope it's true.
Have you been listening to the reports and how things are going so far tonight?
Oh, yes, I've had the TV on all the time.
Your son, Jack, told me today that he one time said he thought that the president would get 1,200 votes on the first ballot. What do you think about that?
That's a lot.
Don't think it's going to be that good, huh?
I don't know. I hope so.
How are you enjoying Kansas City and the convention?
Very much so, until I just tripped.
Thank you. We're sorry if we caused that.
All right. I'm sorry. I tried to keep my eye on you and didn't see the curve.
Back to you, Walter.
Mariah?
Yes.
Somebody handed me a card here just before we got to that picture that she had had a fall out there. Did she fall down?
What she did was she was coming out of the car and down this ramp, which is behind me, and all the reporters, including yours truly, sort of said, Mrs. Ford, and she looked at us, and as she did, there's a sort of a steep incline here. She fell, but the Secret Service men and members of her family grabbed her, and she says she's fine. Back to you, Walter.
Okay, thank you, Mariah. I just had that little bit of a report, and we certainly had to clear it up. We couldn't leave it hanging that way. I'm glad that Mrs. Ford is all right. She's on her way into the hall now, and Mrs. Hutter, the head of the Republican National Federation, or the National Federation of Republican Women, had just completed her remarks, and as I was saying just before Mrs. Ford arrived, John McDonald, the chairman of the Credentials Committee, is about to give his report. There were some delegate challenges, but they were settled in the committee, and no fights will be brought to this floor.
Photographers David Ludwig of Kansas City, Missouri. Now, if all the alternates and delegates would look to your toward the CBS anchor booth on my right. And if you could refrain from moving or speaking for 30 seconds, you may set a record, and you may also receive a photograph. And so if we can do that for 30 seconds, we'll have taken the official photograph. If you look toward the right, the CBS anchor booth.
I'd like you to know that we're not taking the official photograph here from the CBS anchor booth, but the official photographer is right above us here, and we're a convenient reference point. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will continue after this message.
CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76. The third session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company on behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers. Ford wants to be your car company. Now, here again is Walter Cronkite.
The Rules Committee Chairman is just beginning to read the rules, and shortly we'll be getting to that 16C fight. Right now there's something going on in the Mississippi delegation. Mike Wallace can tell us what. Mike?
Walter, convention politics, Mississippi style, have taken over down here in the Mississippi delegation. We told you earlier that they had voted 31-28 to the Ford people won on 16C this afternoon. And the unit rule was going to give them 30 votes against 16C. Well, there was a headline in the Birmingham paper today which quoted Rogers Morton as saying that President Ford intends to bypass the Cotton South in his campaign between now and the convention. That infuriated a good many people here in the Mississippi delegation, the Alabama delegation, and so forth. And now the Reagan people are asking for a caucus. They want to go off the floor, the Reagan people in this Mississippi delegation. They want to go off the floor and hold a caucus and break the unit rule. And they think that they now have some adherence to their cause. So there's been a fight going on. Shall we or shall we not leave the floor for a caucus in order to break the unit rule? Doug Shanks is the leader of the Ford forces here in the Mississippi delegation. Doug, can you explain just exactly what this fight is about?
Probably not, Bill.
Try it. Go ahead.
Basically, they're taking a vote now to see if the Mississippi delegation wants to caucus.
Well, I know, but you're going to caucus about whether you break the unit rule.
Exactly.
Now, you don't want them to break the unit rule.
No, that's not the question. The question is, this afternoon we agreed on one thing, and now we get here and we disagree. And they know my position, and I've held it. And this afternoon, while we were in caucus, they brought up 3 times, does anybody want to break the unit rule? And the answer was no. And now they want to break it.
Why do they want to break the unit rule now?
Well, the first thing is, we asked for a caucus 3 times yesterday, and we weren't granted it. Now, just on the drop of a hat, we've got one.
Malcolm Mabry, tell me, why do you people now want this caucus? Why do you want to break the unit rule? Malcolm?
We think this is the ball game tonight.
How do you mean? Explain.
If we can pass 16C, adopt it on the floor of the convention, this will force the hand of President Ford. This is the ball game.
Was it the headline in the Birmingham paper and the fact that President Ford, according to Rogers Morton, is going to give short shrift to what is called the Cotton South that started this thing in motion?
I don't know whether that's what started it. I will certainly have to tell you that it played a part in this.
Did you hear John Tower a little bit earlier saying that Rogers Morton had shot his mouth off? He said that to Clark Reed, and that the president called Clark Reed today and said that he had no intention of giving short shrift to the South in the campaign.
Senator Tower said that?
Yes, he did.
Well, I've not heard the president say it.
Well, are you indeed going off for a caucus, Doug?
I'm not. No.
In other words, the Ford people
aren't going. No.
Therefore, it's just the Reagan people who are going to caucus.
Well, it appears that way.
The legions of the already convinced are going to go off and talk to each other?
There may be some others that'll go with us.
As I said, there's never a convention, Democrat or Republican, without a real Donnybrook in the Mississippi convention, Walter, in the Mississippi delegation.
Mike, the Rules Committee chairman is Kent McGough of Ohio. He's the chairman of the Ohio Republican State Committee. He's now making his little talk before presenting the rules themselves. talk about the fairness of the rules, procedures on the Republican Party as opposed to those of the Democratic Party, a somewhat partisan view, of course. While he's doing that, Dan Rather has been covering the Reagan floor leaders. He can report on what progress perhaps they're making on this rules fight. Dan?
Walter, I've just talked to two of the Reagan floor leaders, including Mr. Black, who came from the trailer in the rear. They are still talking a good game, but the sense, the feel down here on the floor, whether it is the Pennsylvania delegation or the Michigan delegation, is this. It's slipping away, if indeed the Reaganites ever had it, on 16C, the vote to try to force President Ford to make known his vice presidential preference before the presidential vote. Pennsylvania is probably as good an example as any. Right now, Richard Frame, who is the delegation chairman in Pennsylvania, figures that he can deliver. Not the delegation chairman.
Not as the delegation chairman.
I stand corrected. He is the leader of the Ford forces in this delegation, whatever title he cares to call himself. And what you're seeing is a portrait of a politician at work. It's hot down on the floor. It's extremely crowded. There have been little touches of bitterness between the Ford and Reagan people developed tonight for the first time in my observation.
No, not in Pennsylvania.
Not in Pennsylvania, but over between Texas and the balcony. They had a sign tearing down and that sort of thing a little bit earlier. The point is this.
The delegation does not behave that way. We are friends and we are unified, and we're going to conduct ourselves in such a way that we're going to elect whoever the nominee of this convention is.
So you hope. But the point is this, that in Pennsylvania, earlier this evening, indications were that perhaps there'd be 85 votes for the Ford position, that is against 16C and forcing the president to name his vice presidential choice before he himself is nominated. Now, our own rough poll of the delegation is there may be as many as 89 votes in this delegation. Overall, the flow is away from the Reaganites on this question and toward the Ford forces. Subtly, the Reagan forces have been shifting and beginning to say, well, even if we don't win out on 16C, we're going to do better on the platform. Now, Mr. Frame, it strikes me that they may have a point, that it may be easier for the Reaganites, if they're going to win one, to win on the platform. In your delegation, would that be the case?
In my opinion, the Ford forces were more susceptible to intrusion on the rules vote than they are on the platform.
Thank you very much. So, Walter, they think that they can do just as well on the platform as on 16C. Mrs. Ford is coming into the hall, as you know.
Right, Dan.
Thank you.
Mrs. Reagan, I think, is coming into the hall, Nancy Reagan, and setting off another demonstration here. This came just as Kent McHugh, the chairman of the Rules Committee and the chairman of the Ohio Republican State Committee, partner in the Columbus Insurance Agency, was getting to the part of the rules concerning the vice presidential nominations and the Rule 16C. Now we'll have a break here for this demonstration for Nancy Reagan. One gets the definite impression here that the wives of the candidates for the presidential nomination are being moved like pawns, or perhaps like queens, in a chess game. Nancy Reagan's arrival tonight must have been timed by the Reagan forces for the maximum impact just before this vote. Even as last night, the arrival of Mrs. Ford seemed to be timed to stem an overwhelming demonstration that was going on for Nancy Reagan. Tony Orlando has chosen this moment of the demonstration for Nancy Reagan to strike up a dance with Mrs. Ford. CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention will continue in a moment. arrival of distinguished persons who are in support of one or another candidate in political conventions is not a new art, of course. It's gone on for time immemorial, an attempt to influence the delegates. There has only been one occasion where a candidate for the nomination itself ever appeared in the hall before the vote, that is, a declared candidate. That was back in 1956 when Estes Kefauver was in a tight nomination race with Adlai Stevenson, and Kefauver appeared at the hall in the spectator seats with his aged father. He said the reason was that his father wanted to come to the convention hall and that he had to escort him. He had to have somebody bring him, and so Estes was the man. But of course it did break precedent and set off quite a demonstration and a lot of criticism from the Stevenson people, naturally. These Reagan people are quite vociferous. When Connally finished his speech, of course, there was a round of applause for John Connally, and in the middle of it, the Reagan people took up the chant and the cheers, and it was hard to tell whether it was John Connally who was getting the applause or Reagan who was getting some more support from his rather noisy supporters here. Connally, I think, thought it was the latter. He didn't care for the fact that they had overridden the tribute from these delegates to him. That tribute divided somewhat in this hall, too. There were a lot of people sitting on their hands. Connally is a very controversial figure in this party. Dan Rather is on the floor there with the National Republican Chairman, Rogers Morton.
Hold on a second.
He's the Ford chairman, of course, Dan.
Right. Rogers Morton just came on the floor to visit with the Michigan delegation. Mr. Morton, as I understand it, the Mississippi delegation is considerably upset, to say the least, about a quote that's attributed to you that you'd urge the president to write off the South.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I said in the interview that we weren't going to write off anything, but that some states obviously would be easier than others. But I believe the president, when he's nominated, can take Plains, Georgia.
In order that our viewers understand this situation fully, particularly for those who may have tuned in late, the Mississippi delegation, which is under the unit rule, is going to vote all the way with President Ford tonight on 16C. That is, supporting the president's position not to force him to name his presidential choice before he himself went under the nomination roll call. Now the Mississippians, whether you said it or not, are considerably upset about what they think you said.
I'm very anxious that they not be upset, because I think the South is Republican country. Obviously, some states are easier than others, but I believe very strongly that the Republicans this fall can take all of the southern states.
Do you think this is possible, that it's possible this is going to tip over the Mississippi vote for Reagan tomorrow night?
I hope not. If
but
they were
really... Do you think it will?
I do not think it will. I do not. I think the Mississippi delegation will hold fast.
Is it true, Mr. Morton, that you have been, when asked by President Ford, urging that he go for a Northerner for vice president?
No, I'm not. I've always been a Connally fan and a Baker fan, and I don't see any reason why I should change.
It isn't true, then, that you've been urging Ruckelshaus, William Ruckelshaus and Dan Evans?
No, I have not.
Have you talked to anyone in Mississippi about this situation?
No, and I'm going to. I've been talking to them on the telephone, trying to assure them that I absolutely believe that the president can take all of the southern states. Obviously, some are easier than others. I said in the interview that I wasn't going to write off anything. It was the headline that was bad, not the article.
What did the headline say?
The headline had a question mark and said, "Will Ford write off the Cotton South?" Obviously, I don't think we'll write off anything. We'll take the fight right to Plains, Georgia.
What did your man in the Mississippi delegation that you talked with on the telephone say to you when he called?
I have been trying to talk to them on the telephone. I haven't gotten through, but I think John Towers talked to them, and I think that 2 or 3 others have. What I hope they'll do is read the whole story, because obviously I'm not for writing off anything. Hell, I'm a Southerner myself.
Are you going over to Mississippi right now?
I hadn't planned to. I was told to come here, but I will go over to Mississippi. I think.
Can we walk over there with you?
Sure.
Well, let's go over if you don't mind. Would that be all right? Well, let's go over and try to get this straightened out. Mr. Morton, right over here. Rogers Morton came on the floor, as many of the operatives for both sides have been doing in his shirt sleeves because it's so warm.
We ran completely out of Morton. Horses we had in
Excuse me, we're going to try to go over to the Mississippi delegation and straighten out something. I think, Mr. Morton, we might be better off if we can get over this way. It's going to take us a few minutes to get over there, Walter. The floor is so crowded down here. And if I'm any judge of Rogers Morton's conversation, and I think I may be, having covered him some over the years, he's concerned about this situation. He does genuinely feel that there's been a misunderstanding in the Mississippi delegation, but anytime you're talking about a delegation with 30 votes, as Mississippi is under the unit rule now, why you could understand why he'd be concerned and want to get over and straighten it out.
Dan, you're a pretty good-sized fellow, but you've got a husky running back there to help you.
That's true. Right this way, Mr. Secretary. I believe right over this way. Excuse me. We'll try to get him right over here. As you can see, anyone who's well acquainted in Republican circles as Rogers Morton, he knows a lot of people. He wants to stop and talk for just a moment to one of the floor operatives. As you recall, the men in the yellow hats are part of the Ford whip operation on the floor, and Rogers Morton is trying to talk to one of them right now, and apparently to ask him what he's heard. Rogers Morton is getting the increasing feeling that this thing may be a little larger than he had first figured on. He's taking the time to do some policy.
How you been? Good to see you, sir. Morton coming down. Going to Mississippi. Well, as a matter of fact, you know he fell down and broke his ribs. No, I didn't.
Rogers Morton doing a little politicking with delegates in the Kentucky section.
I got home a college.
Mr. Secretary, right this way to Mississippi, I think.
All right.
Thank you. Talk to him private. Sure, I understand. Sure. Walter, Mr. Morton now has thought the better of going over to Mississippi and has just said to me that he thinks he better talk to them privately. He's had second thoughts about this whole operation, and he's now gone over to discuss the matter with two of the whips, the floor whips for President Ford. Both of them, of course, in close contact with Senator Robert Griffin, who is the man in control on the floor for President Ford. And he said he wanted to talk to them privately.
Coming into the Mississippi. I'll get him. Guys turning headed that way.
Morton doesn't really seem to be in any great hurry to get over there, to speak frankly about it, Walter. I think, Walter, the best thing for us, considering the crowd at that Mississippi delegation, is to depend on Mike Wallace perhaps to catch up with Rogers Morton when he gets over there. Walter, he stopped to talk to the Reagan operative now. No, I'm sorry. This is the man in the red hat is another of Senator Griffin's floor operatives for President Ford. It's going to take Rogers Morton, I think, Walter, at least another 4 or 5 minutes to get over the Mississippi delegation.
Okay, Dan, we'll be keeping an eye on you and listening to you, and we'll pick you up when you got something there. Meanwhile, on the convention floor, the chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McHugh, is just about to finish his formal report before getting to Rule 16C. CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention will continue in a moment. The clerk is now reading the amendment for Rule 16, which we'll get down to Section C in just a moment. Let's listen.
In making the nominations for President and Vice President and voting thereon, in no case shall the call of the roll be dispensed with. The total time of the nominating speech and seconding speeches for any candidate for President or Vice President shall not exceed 15 minutes. Amendment offered by Delegate Thomas B. Curtis. Add a new section to read.
is an unruly convention tonight, and they haven't even gotten to the rule that makes them unruly.
Please be seated. Will the delegates and alternates please be seated so we can hear the argument on this debate? Ladies and gentlemen, this is most important business. It may affect the outcome of whatever happens here, if anything. I will ask the reading clerk, Mr. Bartlett, to proceed with the reading of the amendment. In fact, I think I'll ask Mr. Bartlett to reread the amendment.
Amendment offered by Delegate Thomas B. Curtis of Missouri. Add a new section to read, Section C. All persons seeking to be nominated for president under Sections A and B above shall announce to the convention and file with its secretary a declaration stating whom he or she will recommend to the convention as the vice presidential nominee. This declaration shall be filed with the secretary of the convention by 9:00 a.m. on the day on which the nomination for president is held. This declaration shall state the person's name and that he or she has agreed to accept such nomination. No delegate or alternate to the convention shall be bound by any commitment of any kind, public or private, to support any presidential candidate who does not file such a declaration.
The clerk reading that resolution is Joe Bartlett, the minority clerk of the House of Representatives.
Now, I would only ask that you listen to me for about 30 seconds. I'm about to read the agreement between the Ford and Reagan forces as to how we might dispose of this matter. And I think it's very important that all the delegates and alternates who may be asked to participate have a right to be heard. And I would therefore ask the media to conclude their interviews in the aisles and permit those who are here to conduct the business. I would ask that the aisles be cleared, and I would alert the Sergeant at Arms that the aisles will be cleared. I hope he has. I would ask the media to please retire to the rear of the room and conduct your interviews in that area. There are many delegates who are seated on the aisle who probably can't even participate because you're there. Will the Sergeant at Arms please cooperate? Or will the media please cooperate? Would all those in the aisles please move to the rear of the arena? All those in the aisle on my right, all those in the aisle on my left. We want to get on with this very important business. The delegates have a right to be heard. Those presenting the argument for the amendment and against the amendment have a right to be heard. And I ask those on my immediate left to please clear the aisle.
Red-coated agents of the Sergeant at Arms being a appointed post at the convention, but he has his agents out on the floor who are hired guards, in effect, and ushers. And they are now moving out into the aisles, trying to carry out the edict of temporary chairman Bob Dole that the aisles be cleared. Well, certainly media representatives are out in the aisles, so are an awful lot of delegates. They've got to the media people seem to be moving voluntarily, the delegates not so quickly.
The aisles will be clear. And I thank those who are cooperating for cooperating, and those who are not, I thank them for I know they will be cooperating. Will the sergeant at arms please clear the aisles?
If Bob Dole succeeds in really clearing these aisles, it's going to be the first time, I think, that I've ever been to a political convention. That goes back a quarter of a century or more, where the aisles have been cleared. And that precedes the days of television, too.
Can all the delegates see what's happening or hear what's happening? Ladies and gentlemen, I will now read the agreement. The chair wishes to advise the delegates of the procedure we shall follow in acting upon the amendment to the report of the Committee on Rules and Order of Business. And I would ask our guests in the gallery to please withhold any audible conversation. The delegates are entitled to hear the debate. The delegates have a very important decision to make. The delegates want to make that decision objectively. And those who are guests and those who may be in the hall standing or seated or otherwise, please bear with us just for a while. The chair should first state that both Chairman McHugh and Delegate Tom Curtis, who has offered the amendment, have mutually agreed to this procedure. Debate on the amendment will be limited to 30 minutes, which will be equally divided between Chairman McHugh and Mr. Curtis. They may each use their time as they see fit, using it all themselves or yielding time to other speakers. When all the time has elapsed, the question before the convention will be the adoption of the amendment to the report of the Committee on Rules and Order of Business. If there is no objection to the procedures outlined by the chair, we shall proceed. The chair hears none and is so ordered. The chair now recognizes Delegate Tom Curtis to open debate. Tom.
Tom Curtis, former congressman from Missouri, speaking for the Reagan Amendment.
Ladies and gentlemen, this evening we have the opportunity to improve and strengthen our party's procedures for the selection of a vice presidential nominee. Even more important, we have the opportunity to demonstrate to millions of our fellow citizens who are watching that we Republicans are wise enough to learn from recent painful experience. This evening, our party should make a binding moral commitment to the principles of openness, full disclosure, and complete trust in the American people. You, my fellow delegates, are the representatives of the people at this convention, and they are watching and waiting for you to decide between secrecy and candor, between politics as usual, and our acceptance of new responsibility in the national interest. Before explaining why I believe the proposed change in Rule 16 is necessary, I wish to offer my credentials as a veteran reformer of parliamentary and campaign procedures. During my 18 years as a congressman from Missouri, I served as the ranking Republican on the Joint House-Senate Committee to reorganize and modernize the rules of the Congress, a job, I might add, that still needs to be done. In 1964, I served our party's national convention as acting parliamentarian. Until last May 21st, I was chairman of the Federal Elections Commission in protest to the successful attempt of the Democratic Congress, led by the now infamous Wayne Hayes, to destroy the Commission's independence. I asked the President not to reappoint me. Finally, I'm the fellow who ran against Tom Eagleton for the Senate in 1968. And we recall how his hasty selection for the 1972 Democratic ticket led to a fiasco. As usual, since the Eagleton episode, the Democrats have talked about reform, but haven't done anything except stage a political beauty parade through Plains, Georgia, an empty crusade for the benefit of the news media. Since 1972, our own party's Rule 29 committee, recognizing the need for reform in this important area, has urged that improvement be proposed. Our proposal is responsive to this unmet need. It is a serious and constructive proposal made at a time when our party has compelling reasons to bear public witness to its desires for reform. Our proposed change in Rule 16 unites political science theory with practical political reality. It satisfies the needs of theory by recognizing the enormous importance that the office of vice presidency has acquired in recent years. It reforms plainly wrong and potential tragic procedures, including the use of the nation's second highest office as bait in fishing for convention delegates. It eliminates the frantic post-midnight scramble of the delegates to find out something about the man secretly chosen. Most important, it ends the denial of the convention's delegates' right to know, enabling them to fill their responsibility to choose a ticket that will win the election and govern the nation according to a strategy and a philosophy known in advance. Now let's consider some of the practical effects. Under our proposal, the convention keeps its powers. A majority of the delegates can reject any vice presidential choice, but the big change is that the power of the convention is now real. Under our proposal, the presidential candidate retains his traditional freedom to choose a compatible running mate. He is not restricted in any way in his method of selection. He can choose his team as he pleases, but the big change before is that he must tell us in advance who's on the team before expecting us to join it. Our proposal requires that the presidential candidate trust the delegates and take them into his confidence before they cast their votes. The proposed change adds only a day, just 24 hours, to the decision-making process, but it also adds real meaning. I believe such sharing of decision-making responsibility is fair because the delegates and all Americans are bound to share the long-term consequences of the candidate's decision, for good or ill. We have a right to be consulted for a day when the effects of our decision may be felt for years to come. There's always a temptation to make reforms effective at some later date. I say we recognize the problem we have for years. We've seen and felt its bad effects. Now it's time for us to act responsibly and constructively. Now is the time for all of us to join in picking our best team and follow it to victory in November. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes of my time to the delegate from Wisconsin, Mrs. Doreen Gunderson.
Mrs. Gunderson will be speaking against the amendment for the Ford position.
Fellow delegates, my name is Doran Gunderson, and I'm from Wisconsin. I have read this amendment, and I understand it. Therefore, I emphatically oppose it. The reasons for this last-minute amendment smack of desperation and blatant political opportunism. Now I believe it is time to really tell it like it is. This amendment is for one time, one place, and one candidate, and not for posterity. Furthermore, none of you, not one, has participated in the choice for the vice presidential candidate who was designated by Governor Reagan. I believe that we must speak honestly about this issue, and the only reason for this proposal is to minimize or offset the political mistake of naming Senator Schweiker as their vice presidential nominee. As Paul Harley, chairman of Governor Reagan's home state, so aptly put it,
Harley is the chairman of the Republican Party, but he's not a Reagan delegate.
the real reason for this proposal is misery loves company. Thank you.
More speeches on 16C to come when the Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News resumes after this message. Eleanor Ring Stores of California is speaking for the Reagan proposed Rule 16C. She just got a good laugh from this convention when she said she is reminded of a bridegroom who is about to be married on Wednesday night, but on Wednesday morning hasn't decided which girl to take for his bride. Mrs. Storrs speaking.
Families don't know who's invited to the wedding. It is of prime importance for our Republican Party that we know in advance who will head our team at the top. And we hope we'll have your support for 16C for the good of the Republican Party. Thank you very much.
The Mississippi delegation widely split, deeply divided on both the Reagan and Ford issue and the issue of 16C, that had earlier decided to vote as a bloc against 16C, is now caucusing off the floor of the convention in one of the trailers right behind the convention hall. We certainly haven't seen this kind of spirit at a national political convention since, I think, probably the 1964 convention, when this party was deeply divided between the Goldwater forces and the more moderate liberal forces of the party.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just remind you that I know it's a very enthusiastic audience. For that, we're grateful as Republicans, but this is an agreement entered into by both parties. Those on each side have a right to be heard. Those supporting the amendment, those opposing the amendment, I trust you'll keep that in mind, because everyone who walked up to this podium is a little nervous to start with. Don't frighten us anymore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 additional minutes of my time to Mrs. Carla Correa of Hawaii, and I'd appreciate it if you would give her your attention. Mrs. Correa.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, I'm Carla Correa, delegate from Hawaii. In 1972, I served on the National Convention Rules Subcommittee assigned to consideration of vice presidential selection reform. And for the past 2 years, I have served on the Rule 29 Committee and the Rules Committee of the Republican National Committee before serving as your vice chairman on the Rules Committee of this convention. During my tenure, we have fully discussed all of the vice presidential selection process proposals. Many different proposals were presented. Some had merit, others did not. However, my fellow delegates, none of the proposals were presented without careful and adequate deliberation, study, and debate. And there have been no proposals made for purely partisan political purposes. This amendment, presented by the Reagan Committee last week, is nothing more than a last-minute political maneuver. Fellow delegates, I would like to tell you that this proposal has been rejected not only once, but twice. But it's been rejected by the Rules Committee of the Republican National Committee and the Rules Committee of this convention. Rejected by a resounding margin. This proposal is tampering with the institution of the vice presidency. If we are to be the first of the 2 major national Republican parties to adopt reform, it must be after thoughtful consideration, not political gimmickry. This proposal has had little thought, and 16C is designed to benefit only one candidate. It is not a constructive vice presidential selection process, and for this reason, it should be voted down.
That was Carla Correa of Hawaii, vice chairman of the Rules Committee. The Convention Rules Committee did turn down this proposition, 59 to 44 votes, and that's why it's come up on the floor of the convention as an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I yield an additional 2 minutes of my time to the distinguished chairman from Arkansas, Mr. Lynn Lowe.
Mr. Chairman, fellow delegates, I came from Texarkana, Arkansas to join you in this convention to do 2 things: to nominate the next president and nominate the next Vice President of the United States. And I tell you, I think that we got the two best candidates running in America today. And for this reason, I am opposed to Rule 16C. My reason is basic and it's simple. It disenfranchises me and it disenfranchises you. Many of you know, because I have spoke with you,
There is something going on down in the New York delegation we're trying to find out. We saw the chairman, Rosenbaum, of the New York delegation, the bald-headed gentleman there, seemed to be chasing some large man off the floor, and now he is somebody being escorted off the floor by the guards. We'll find out in a moment what that was about. It looked like quite a little ruckus down in the New York delegation for a moment. The New York delegation has been having its troubles all day. It's overwhelmingly for Ford, but the Reagan people in the delegation are complaining against cavalier treatment by the dominant Ford forces. They insisted today that they be heard when Jack Ford, the president's son, was going to be before the caucus, and they caused so much fuss about that finally Rosenbaum just invited young Jack Ford to leave, said it's the only way you get order back in the New York caucus. What that was down there right now, we don't know. Our reporters, as you know, were asked to leave the floor. This shows one of the difficulties of not having access to the floor. We can't find out when something like this does happen. The guards are trying now to keep the assembled press from going down the aisle to the New York delegation. We hope we can get an answer on this story in a few moments. Bob Dole, the temporary chairman, trying to get order again.
The delegates please take their seats.
Mort Dean is down with the New York group now. Mort, come in.
Walter, what happened? There are two problems here. Number one, someone with a Utah credential came by and ripped the phone out of the socket, a phone belonging to Richard Rosenbaum, the chairman of the New York delegation. But we have another problem. The Burns guards here will not permit us news people on the floor. They claim that, and we're really being shoved around, that Senator Dole has ordered them to clear the aisles. And could you explain what the problem is now?
They just had a little ruckus over a sign down there at Mr.
Okay, but why aren't the news people being allowed on the floor?
They're going to now dinner now.
We're being allowed on the floor now, Walter. Let me walk down and see what Richard Rosenbaum himself has to say. He's on the telephone. Excuse me. He demanded that the authorities here arrest that gentleman from Utah, but he was escorted off the floor. Mr. Rosenbaum now is on one telephone that is working.
I can't understand you.
We'll be able to talk with him in just a moment. Tell us what happened now.
Well, all I know is some guy came charging over and tore out my phone.
He tore out the President's Ford? Why?
Yeah, he tore out the Ford phone, and he also damaged my other phone.
And what did he say to you?
He was from Reagan. He was a Reagan man.
From where?
Because he had a Reagan button on.
And what did he say to you?
Well, no, I think he's vice chairman of one of those delegations.
And then what happened?
Well, then he ran out to back there, and I went back and asked him to have him arrested.
What reason did he give?
I don't know. Something to do with the sign. I don't know. What something to do with me. I think they got him, yeah.
Did you get your phone back in?
No, the phone's torn out. Look at it.
Now, which phone is that, Dick? Which phone is that?
I've got to have it. It represents a whole bunch of states.
Dick, which phone is that?
My white Ford phone.
And where does that go?
That connects to the trailer.
The trailer, the Ford trailer, the command.
Yes.
Okay, that's no longer working.
And not only that, but my other phone is damaged that too.
So you can't get, if you want to get some
I can't
instructions
do
from the
anything.
Ford trailer, you can't.
Yeah.
Is the Reagan phone?
Don't have one.
Walter, that's the story from the New York delegation. A phone ripped out, a brief scuffle, and a lot of pushing and shoving right now. Walter?
Well, as I noted a moment ago, Mark, I'm not sure my microphone was on at the moment that I did. Certainly, when the aisles are cleared of delegates who jam the aisles as well as media, it makes for an orderly procedure down there, except when there is news. And when there is news, unfortunately, the media can't get to it. That was your problem a moment ago, and we'd have had this settled about 4 or 5 minutes ago instead of waiting now and holding up the work of the convention. Bob Dole is waiting for apparently this matter to be cleared up before he really works on getting order again and get back to the debate on Rule 16C. If there's anybody out there who tuned in so late that they don't know what's going on now with 16C, we might use this moment of confusion to recount the situation for you. This is the major test vote of the 31st Quadrennial Republican Convention. While the balloting for the president comes tomorrow night, this, in effect, is it. Both sides have admitted that. It's a test vote on a rule that has been proposed by the Reagan forces that would require the presidential nominees, those seeking the nomination to name their vice presidential candidate, in the morning before that balloting, tomorrow morning. Mike Wallace is outside the hall where the Mississippi delegation has been caucusing on this matter. Mike?
They're not caucusing. They're having a meeting, they say. They're just having a friendly meeting. And look where they're having it, Walter. You see where it says CBS Correspondence? That's our office. Mudd, Rather, Dean, and I, office inside there, and somebody offered them the facilities of the CBS trailer, and they've been in there for about 10 or 15 minutes. They are basically the Reagan people in the Mississippi delegation. What they want to do is break that unit rule. As you know, earlier today, they voted 31 to 28 to go with President Ford and not with Ronald Reagan on 16C. And then they decided to go with the unit rule, which is 30 to nothing, to go with Ford and not Reagan on 16C. And then that story about Rogers Morton saying that the president was not going to pay all of that attention to the Cotton South upset a good many people, the Reagan people, inside that Mississippi delegation, and Clark Reed, indeed. It turned out that they decided they wanted a caucus. But the Ford people in the Mississippi delegation refused to leave the floor. They didn't want a caucus. So for the last 10 or 15 minutes, they've been in there talking. Now, we have a couple of operatives inside. Bill Moyer's son, they don't know that, and Roger Mudd's son. So we'll find out from the Mississippi delegates when they get out what happened. And then, of course, we'll get the straight dope from Moyers and Mudd, Walter.
Thank you, Mike. Can't you demand to go in and use your phone?
Somebody made a deal. I suggested my office, my desk, that I would be an impartial observer. They didn't buy it, but they didn't recognize Moyers and Mudd, who were inside.
Mike, that little discussion is still going on down the floor here about what happened in the New York delegation. Quite a little fuss going on down there. Nelson Rockefeller had been holding up the phone that was torn out by, they claim, a Utah delegation man.
The door is coming open.
Maybe that is true.
Here's Moyers.
Utah delegation told Dan Rather they tore out the phone because they claim that Vice President Rockefeller tore down
what happened in there? Matthew Mudd, young Moyers, what happened in there?
They were deciding whether or not to break unit rule.
And what did they finally decide?
Well, they tried to take a vote of the people that were in there, but not everyone was in there. So they couldn't decide. I think there was 22, 23. Some of them, I think, are still on the floor.
There were 21 people in there, and they said they couldn't vote unless they had the entire delegation.
The majority of them want to break unit rule or vote themselves out from under it. That's what they said.
Well, how did they... What did that... This is Perry Wolf's son, John Wolf.
Yeah. They said they've missed most of the delegation. They're sure they had 28 before. They're sure they can get 31 now.
All right. I tell you what. Here's Vic Marver. He is the Reagan whip in the Mississippi delegation. Vic, if you'll come on down here and we'll now find out what kind of reporters we have in Moyers, Wolf, and Mudd here. Vic Marver.
Are you ready?
Yep.
What would you like to know?
I would like to know what happened inside around my desk.
Well, it appears that the vote on 16C is extremely close.
You mean in Mississippi or all across the country?
All across the country,
right,
and in Mississippi.
Yeah.
There are a few more votes needed in order for 16C to pass.
Right.
Or to win.
Right.
Right now, the Mississippi delegation is going to be polled individually on whether or not to come out from under the unit rule on this particular issue.
I see.
If we come out from under the unit rule on this particular issue, only the delegates will vote.
Gotcha.
And the delegates will be polled individually to determine who is for and who is against it.
Coming out from under the unit rule.
On only this particular... No. If we come out from under the unit rule...
Yes.
Then the delegates will be polled.
I understand. Have the Ford people in your delegation agreed to this procedure?
Some of the Ford people have refused to come to this meeting.
Most of them?
Not all of them, but some of them.
Right.
We are going to poll them individually, and they will participate in the poll.
Is it that important? You think the vote is that close across the country that perhaps 15 votes in Mississippi could make that much difference?
This is what we have been told.
Malcolm Mabry told me that this is the ball game, that if you lose here, you've lost, period. You've lost tomorrow night, too.
That's not correct, because the vote on 16C cut both ways. There were some people in the Ford camp and some people in the Reagan camp who voted one way or the other. It's not a clear-cut Ford-Reagan decision in the Mississippi delegation.
Did you found it cool, pleasant?
You mean
No,
friendly?
inside there. Friendly,
Yeah.
inside the CBS correspondence
Very
booth.
friendly, very cool, very comfortable, and we thank CBS for the use of it.
All right. Thanks for the use of the hall, Walter.
Marty Plissner surveyed all the delegations, and he reports a majority of about 50 votes against 16C, which is still being debated out here. That is 50 votes for the Ford position, a majority of 50, without even counting Mississippi either way. And now Mort Deans with Nelson Rockefeller.
Governor, what happened? The part of the phone is down there on the floor. Could you show our viewers what happened to it? It's right around there. Could we have that handle down there, please? Here, let me just bend down. Could I borrow this for a sec? Governor, could you stand up for a moment? Just stand up. The phone people are here connecting it. You have a disconnected phone, Vice President.
We've got the telephone people, I want to tell you, with the greatest efficiency and the most tremendous speed. They're right on the job.
Okay.
And I've got to give them back
All
the
right.
equipment so they can put it in.
A good plug for the phone company, but...
Can we have a conference up at the box with Tower and the boys right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Vice President, could you just tell us what happened now? What did you see?
What did I say?
No, what did you see? I mean, who did it and what happened here? It's the seat
Somebody
next
came
to
by
yours.
whom none of us knew and just told Dick Rosenbaum that if he didn't get that sign back, he was going to rip out the phone.
What sign was that?
The Utah delegate says he saw you take a sign from another man that was a Reagan sign.
He
Take
handed
back
it to me. He held it as I went by, and I just took it. I thought he was handing it to me.
And then he came over to get that Reagan sign back.
No, it wasn't he. It was a man from Utah.
Who came to get that Reagan sign from you. Okay. Does this smack of 64 all over again or
it's
not?
just a little light side.
A little light side. Okay.
No, I didn't.
Something new every day.
Yeah, I'm trying to get out, but I can't get out.
Okay. The Vice President wants to get out of here, and he can unless we get out of here. And rather agile 68, I think it is. Okay, there he goes. Secret Service helping. CBS helping. And Walter, back to you.
Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message.
CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76.
West Virginia cast 12 votes yes, 16 votes no.
West Virginia, 12 aye, 16 no.
That was a pickup for Reagan in West Virginia. Well, it's still close enough so that Mississippi's 30 votes could make a difference if they went to Reagan, but Mike Wallace says they're going to go for Ford.
The state of Wisconsin cast 45 votes no.
That was as expected, and that almost puts it out of reach of Reagan. It can be said, I think at this point, with only Wyoming left to vote and Mississippi. And here's Wyoming.
Vote. Madam Secretary, Wyoming, the equality state, casts 9 votes aye, 8 votes no.
Wyoming.
So all of the uncommitted votes in Wyoming went to the Ford position as well. And as you see there, even with 30 more votes from Mississippi, which Reagan apparently is not going to get on the Reagan side, he couldn't win it. It appears that President Ford's forces have held here at this important, crucial point of the Republican convention that, according to this ballot, which seemed to split exactly as we had anticipated at CBS News, President Ford's forces do control this convention, and on the basis of a test vote of 16C, here is Florida, which also passed. That vote has to be counted in there as well before we can conclude it. But
the great Sunshine State cast 38 votes no, 28 votes yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that does it.
Officially, that does it, although, of course, as we saw, officially, we haven't had all the votes counted as yet. Still, if those... And there you see the vote as it counts. Now, if Mississippi came along with the 30 votes, they still can't possibly do it. It actually was a matter of fact before this Florida vote because of what we know is happening in the Mississippi delegation. But there it is. The Ford forces have won. Both the Ford and the Reagan forces said this afternoon this was a critical vote. They might try to explain it away now, and as you heard a little earlier, some Reagan people are now putting their eggs in the basket of platform changes, but it would appear that the Ford people have the votes. They were tested and found to have them tonight.
38 votes aye, 28 votes no.
Mississippi, 13 votes.
Mississippi, after much consternation and under the unit rule, cast 30 votes no.
Mike Wallace had told us earlier that's the way it is. And that's the end of that test vote. There's no one in this hall who doesn't believe that was an important vote. And there might be only a few in the hall that don't believe it was a critical vote and that the crisis has now been passed for the Ford forces. President Gerald Ford, who did not run for either the vice presidency or the presidency in 1972, will likely leave Kansas City as his party's legitimate nominee before the 1976 election. Now that the first major battle of this convention is over, Eric Sevareid and Bill Moyers have some thoughts on the vote that we've just seen.
Well, Bill Moyers, I think that must represent the high point of the Reagan effort here, wouldn't you? It fell pretty far short of what they hoped on this. More votes for the Ford position than one would expect he'd get for the actual nomination. This was the second stage of the Sears strategy, first stage being the Schweiker announcement, and then to force Ford to do the same kind of thing here. Looks to me like the last gimmick they've got up their sleeve, doesn't it to you?
Yes, a couple of weeks before this convention opened, one of the Reagan assistants said that fighting the Ford organization is kind of like fighting the Spanish Armada. They're bigger, but they don't maneuver very well. Well, this Armada has finally moved into position, and tonight they fired what seems to me to be a very convincing salvo. After a lot of hawing and geeing and misfiring, the Reagan White House has put its house in order and was able to withstand this very
the Reagan White House?
I mean, the Ford White House was able to withstand this very ingenious gambit. And it was just that. Don't you think it was just a gambit?
Well, yes. They were trying to do what Bob Taft, or what Eisenhower rather, did in '52, when Taft was ahead with most of the committed delegates, and they put in this "thou shalt not steal" rule, a vote on it, and it was pretty hard to vote against it, and Taft lost on that, and that really did turn things around with those uncommitted people, so that Eisenhower won. Start doing it here. Of course, in principle, even if the Ford people had lost this and he'd had to reveal his choice, this convention still had the chance to vote against it if they wanted to, just as they could vote against Schweiker. That's their privilege. Almost never has happened. In 1920, Harding, who was going to be the nominee, really wanted Senator Lenroot of Wisconsin as his running mate, and the convention turned around and nominated Cal Coolidge because he was a hero because of the Boston police strike, as I remember it. Or I remember reading about it. I was a bit young then. But this looks like it. I don't see quite what they can do from now on, because the fights on the platform, trying to amend the platform, the morality in foreign policy, for example, I don't think's got much in it, do you?
No, it's going to be very hard, as one of the delegates said earlier, to vote against morality in foreign policy. Although there will be some, it'll be hard for the Ford people to take the language in part of that morality in foreign policy plank, because it is a kick in the pants.
It's a bit offensive, maybe, to Ford and Kissinger. But I wouldn't think it's something they'd put up a fight about. Better, I would think, for their point of view, that they not fight at all and just let that one go. And there's nothing else on the agenda that looks like it's worth fighting about.
One of the interesting results of this poll tonight, I've just been handed this from our computer people, shows how much of a cleavage there is between the East and the West of this party. In the East, only 82 people voted for the Ford position, for the Reagan position. 499 voted for the Ford position. In the Midwest, 175 voted for the Reagan position. 425 voted for the Ford position. In the South, 445 voted for the Reagan position, 156 for Ford. In the West, 366 versus 84. So you can see the distribution of these votes is along the lines of that Sun Belt division that we've been talking about this week.
Well, maybe we can get a little chance later on, if we can, to talk about this whole new regional switch in this country politically. The East and the Midwest now roughly against the South and the West, which is a change from the old days when it was the interventionist East, international East against the isolationist Midwest. The whole thing has changed. It's worth talking about if we get a chance to do that. You have any further thoughts on this?
Well, let me just ask you, if you looked at these figures, if you were Ford looking at these figures tonight, looking at this, where do you think you would have to choose a vice president from?
Well, it all depends, I suppose, or it depends on one thing. Whether you think you can do much against Carter in the South, wouldn't you?
And I don't think they really do believe that they can cut very deeply into his strategy, but they do think that Carter's weak in the West.
He's weak in the West. Yes, he is, and it's now, Ford would now be free to pick who he wants. He doesn't have to pick a perfectly safe and inoffensive person like perhaps a Senator Baker. He can pick somebody with an eye to his capacity to be president, if that should happen, and take his chances. My impression of these people in convention is that while there might be, assuming Ford's nominated, a lot of Reagan people may not raise money for him or work actively for him, but they'll, on the whole, I think, still vote for him because he's still a very conservative man, much more so than Carter has now revealed himself to be. That'll be the trouble. So I think the president has quite a lot of flexibility in what he can do.
Yes, as the voting was taking place, the passion was more than we've seen so far this week, but it was a kind of good-natured hostility you saw out there. And it may be that the Reagan people are not very disgruntled. They're not very gruntled either, but they're not embittered at this moment the way they were the conservatives were in 1964.
No, I don't think they are. I think it can be put together in terms of vote. I don't really believe those polls that indicate if Ford is nominated, a third or more of the Reagan people will vote for Carter or not vote at all, and vice versa. I think in the end they probably will vote for the conservative position. Why not? That's what people usually do. And the trouble then would be organizing a campaign and raising the money. Well, that about exhausts what instant wisdom I've got about this bill. We turn it back to the anchor booth and Walter Cronkite.
The convention has just approved the rules now. That includes the Rule 18, which is the Ford rule that requires the delegations from 19 states to vote as pledged and not as the delegates themselves might wish in their own individual choices. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message.
CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76. Tonight, the third session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company. On behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers, Ford wants to be your car company. Now here again is Walter Cronkite.
The Reagan forces lost here tonight in this auditorium in Kansas City, and it looks as if the Reagan campaign for the presidency may be very near its end. A test vote on the rule change failed, a test that the Reagan forces brought to the convention floor, and now the question is, what will the Reagan forces do? Will they continue to fight, for instance, on the platform, which comes up next, or will they perhaps give up at this point? Well, there's an indication that Leslie Stahl has regarding this matter, that perhaps a compromise on the platform. Come in, Leslie.
Walter, you're absolutely right. I'm standing here with Congressman Treen, who was on the platform committee, and Senator Strom Thurmond. They were just standing here marking over that foreign policy plank, trying to come to some compromise language so there could be no fight here on the floor. The Ford people, having won 16C, are now eager not to have a fight on the foreign policy plank. What kind of language have you written in on that? I noticed you marking off the buzzwords, so to speak.
Well, I wouldn't confirm that. I mean...
well, I saw you do it.
And I don't know what a buzzword is.
Well, I saw, for example, that you wanted to mark out the word détente. Is that right?
No, you're wrong on that.
Well, tell us what you were talking about. Be kind enough.
We've talked about a lot of things in language and change of language which might satisfy both sides, and this is what we're going to pursue now. Senator Thurmond, we hope, will be a voice in order to do this and to accomplish this.
Are you willing to seek a compromise, Senator?
I'm willing to talk to several of the people on the platform committee. I'm not a member of the committee, but I've been asked to talk to them to see if we can make a few changes here that will prevent a big fight on the floor.
Now, we know that there are some conservative members of the platform committee that want stronger language. What is Governor Reagan's position on this? Would he like a compromise?
I do not know what his position is.
You don't? He did write this plank, and it does mention Solzhenitsyn.
I don't know whether he did or not.
Well, I'm told he did.
Look, you had a lot of strong conservatives on the Foreign Policy Committee and on the full committee, and we wrote a very strong plank.
Well, this proposed language is really an attack on Kissinger. Is that the way you read it as a Ford supporter?
I read some implications of attack on the Nixon foreign policy as carried out by Kissinger and on the Ford foreign policies carried out by Kissinger. Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you very much. Walter, we may not have a fight on foreign policy after all. Back to you.
We'll know in a very few minutes. On the convention floor, they have just approved John Rhodes, the congressman from Arizona, and the minority leader in the House of Representatives as the permanent chairman of this convention, and they are singing his praises right now before introducing him to the delegates, most of whom already know John Rhodes. He's anxious to be the majority leader, that is, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he is campaigning for that job, which means he's campaigning for a Republican Congress in 1976. Rogers Morton also would like to have a Republican Congress next year. Rogers Morton, of course, a longtime leader in his party and now the chairman of the Ford campaign for the presidency. And I guess you're a rather delighted man now that you got over this test vote.
It was a very good vote, back as predicted, but we're very excited about it. I think it's a real victory for the president, and I think it's really a victory for the Republican Party. I think amending the rules in the middle of the game is a very difficult thing.
We just heard Leslie Stahl talking to Mr. Treen and some others suggesting that they're now trying to compromise on the foreign policy plank. They were bringing in a little different language on some of the matters. Would you say, Mr. Morton, that you think it's all over?
Well, I don't think you ever ought to think that. I think you ought to fight right down to the wire and fight everywhere. But it does look like that our delegate count is very solid.
Did your count of the delegates work out, as your presidential count of the delegates, work out just about the same on this test vote?
Very close. Closer than you would think, because this is a kind of issue that would cut across the lines between the two candidates. But it's very close.
Were you really seriously concerned about 16C at any particular point when it was first dropped on you by John Sears, maybe, a week or so ago? Did it shake you up a bit?
Not after I saw the vote in the Rules Committee. I thought the vote of 59 to 44, I think it was, in the Rules Committee was very significant, and I thought it showed strength for our position.
Do you see any booby traps now down the road before this time tomorrow night?
Frankly, I do not.
You think the platform will not create any excitement out here or inflame any passions that could tilt the balance?
Platforms never have, and I don't think this one will. And I think the committee, as it reported out the platform, reported out a good platform, and I think we can all live with it. I don't know how these amendments would fare, but I don't think they would fare too well.
Now, there was an awful lot of talk by your forces that 16C would have foreclosed President Ford from inviting Ronald Reagan, either consultation with him or inviting him to be the vice presidential candidate on his ticket. Do you think that Reagan as a possibility in the vice presidential candidate is a possibility?
I certainly wouldn't exclude him. And I certainly would hope that the president would consult with him. I think this is very important. This has been a long primary. It's been a close primary. A tremendous number of Republicans have been involved. And I think it would be very appropriate for President Ford to discuss the matter before he makes the final decision and discuss it with Governor Reagan.
Do you think he intends to do that?
I do. I think he does. I think he intends to do that, yes.
Who's he picked?
I don't know. And I'm glad I don't. Mr. Cronkite, I'm glad I don't know. No, just tell you.
Yeah, just tell me.
I'd love to, but I don't know.
Whisper to me.
Obviously, I wouldn't tell you if I did. But I think the process that he's gone through has been very thorough, and he has certainly got a great deal of input from many, many people. And obviously, I'm sure that this input or these polls that he has taken of the Congress and of other leaders of the party have probably brought forth a good many candidates.
You know, doesn't he have to go to a moderate right in order to bring the party together now? This was a pretty close split for an incumbent president here. Reagan came awfully close in this campaign. Now, that indicates that there are an awful lot of people perhaps more conservative even than President Ford, who isn't exactly a raving liberal.
Well, I think that the president has outlined the qualifications. First, the capacity to govern, the capacity to be president of the United States. I think that's number one. And I think number two, the president would like somebody who is compatible with him. And I think he has, in terms of his philosophy, in terms of the things that he is trying to get done in the country, and so that's the way I think it'll probably fall.
Do you think Senator Connolly is still in the running? Or former Governor Connolly?
I certainly wouldn't exclude anyone.
I think that's about all I'm going to get out of you.
You're not going to get any more.
Rogers Morton, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Coming up and seeing us. We'll see how it all goes tomorrow night, whether your delegate count holds up tomorrow night as well.
Well, I think it will.
Thank you. Shortly after the Reagan forces went down to defeat on this critical rules fight to vote, Jim McManus And other reporters talked to one of the chief Reagan supporters, Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina.
The President will be picking up delegates as a result of this tonight, the psychological benefit that we've been hearing so much about.
Well, I don't know, but it's possible, of course.
Is that a major concern of yours?
Well, of course it's a concern. Nobody likes to see things appearing to go the wrong way, but the ball game's not over. We have the ninth inning yet.
What are you going to do in the ninth inning?
Everything we can.
Senator, was part of this vote tonight saying, these delegates, some of them saying, we want Ronald Reagan for the vice presidency?
Oh, of course, that played in it. Bob Griffin, my good friend in the Senate, played that thing like a fiddle, and he knew better than that. Oh, of course it works. A lot of times in the heat and the confusion of a convention floor, people don't always think exactly straight. If they had stopped, put on their thinking cap, they might have voted differently.
Well, what if these Reagan delegates try to stampede this convention and try to get a draft going for Mr. Reagan as vice president?
Well, I have to take Ronald Reagan at his word. He says that he's not going to accept any offer that may come to him for vice president, and his exact words to me as late as yesterday were no way, and I have to assume that that's his position.
Senator Helms, may we ask you once again, what does this mean tonight, this loss?
Well, just like I said, there's trouble in River City. I would not be leveling with you if I said that I just came from a jubilant trailer there. Of course it's not, but back to the drawing boards.
Senator, before you leave...
Senator Helms is one of the so-called independent conservatives, the group that, for instance, floated the possible candidacy of Senator Buckley, the conservative from New York State, as a presidential candidate here for a while. There has been talk, although Senator Helms has flatly denied it, that he might even lead a walkout of this party if the ticket did not satisfy him. He was against Schweiker for the vice presidential spot on a Reagan ticket. And he still has the capability to cause a lot of interest at this convention, to put it mildly, to still perhaps excite considerable passion here by attempting to bring other matters before the convention. Although with the rules of the convention as they are, it is very difficult to do that from the floor. For instance, on the platform, the only thing they can do besides the minority plank for which they got 25% of the votes of the platform committee to bring before the floor, which satisfies the rule of the convention, the only other thing they can do from the floor is to try to strike parts of the platform. They might try to do that, try to create some passion, but it does seem that the fire has gone out of the Reagan forces tonight with the loss of this important test vote. And one of the very important things to consider, although, again, Jesse Helms brought up the matter of people having voted against 16C so that they could preserve the possibility of Reagan being named as a vice presidential candidate with Ford. The truth of the matter is that as we go down the votes tonight, it turns out that the vote followed precisely the lines of the CBS delegate count for Ford and for Reagan. So there was no subtlety in the casting of any votes in any of the delegations. The vote looks absolutely solid, as our CBS News poll showed it, for Ford and for Reagan, and we will have to take the indications from that President Ford is almost certainly the candidate of this party after the voting tomorrow night. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message.